Okay, so I think we're ready to make a start now. So thanks everyone for coming along, both physically and on Zoom. It's really exciting to have an international visitor at QUT. So I think it's the first international visitor that I've interacted with in the past, I don't know, three or so years. So it's really exciting to have Professor Florence Forbes with us. So Florence, I was meant to ask you how to pronounce these things before I spoke about them, but I didn't get time, but I'll give it a try. So Florence is the Director of Research at Inria, is that correct?
Yep.
In Grenoble,
Yep.
It's close enough, in France, and is also the head of the Statify group. So for the past 20 years, Florence has been working on graphical Markov models, classification methods, and statistical image analysis. But in more recent times, her current interests are in model-based clustering methods, supervised and unsupervised learning, statistical model selection, and also Bayesian methods. So Florence has published many papers, and they're mainly in 4 different domains. So these are statistics and probability, machine learning and pattern recognition, signal and image processing, and biology and medicine. Okay, so I think we're ready to make a start now. So I'm now going to pass it over to Florence, who's going to talk to us about approximate Bayesian computation with surrogate posteriors. Thanks, Florence.
Thank you. So thanks for this introduction, and hello everybody. I'm very happy to be here in Brisbane, and thanks for giving me this opportunity to present our work in person. It's been a while, as you said. We are a bit tired of Zoom, but it's still nice that we could do it. So today I'd like to talk about some recent work on approximate Bayesian computation. So probably many of you know what is ABC. And this is joint work with Yin Nguyen, who's in the room and is actually a neighbor from University of Queensland. It's also joint with Tin Nguyen, who used to be in Caen and is now a postdoc in Grenoble with us. And Julien Arbel, who's also working at Inria in Grenoble. And the 3 of us are in the Statify team, Inria team. So in this work, what we are trying to do, is to address the usual issue in ABC, which is to choose the summary statistics and the distance to compare them. And so we bypass in a way this problem by using a surrogate posterior, and I will explain what are those surrogates in just now. So first, I recall the main ingredients and difficulties in approximate Bayesian computation, ABC. I also talked about semi-automatic ABC, which is related to our approach. Then I'll explain what we mean by surrogate posteriors, and I'll explain how we compute them and how we use them in our ABC procedure. And we call this new ABC procedure Gleam ABC. I'll mention some theoretical properties of these procedures and give some illustration. So first, as usual, we assume that we have a data generating model, meaning that we are able to simulate a parameter value theta from a prior pi. And then from theta and some likelihood f, we are able to simulate some observation z, and this observation in dimension d. And the goal is to estimate theta from some observed y, and more specifically to estimate the posterior pi of theta given y using the Bayes formula. And the ABC in particular, it's related to the cases where, unfortunately, the likelihood f theta is not available, either because it's not tractable or it's too costly to estimate. And so how do we do in these cases? So in this work, we focus mainly on the simple ABC scheme, which is usually called rejection ABC, and it goes as follows. So the goal is to estimate, to get a sample of theta values from the true posterior, given Y. And so it goes as follows. We first simulate some theta m value from the prior pi. And then from theta m and the likelihood, we simulate some Zm, because we know we can simulate. We don't have the likelihood, but we know how to simulate observations from it. And then if this Zm is close enough to our observed Y, we keep the theta m value, and if not, we simulate another one. And how to decide if Zm is close enough to the observed Y is done through a distance d, which is usually a simple Euclidean distance directly between Y and Zm, or most often between a summary statistic of a summary of Y and a summary of Zm. So S is a summary statistic. And so this algorithm is extremely simple, but it may depend quite critically on a number of things. First, the choice of the summary statistic, but also the choice of the distance and the choice of the threshold epsilon under which you decide to keep or not the values. So in this work, we mainly addressed the problem of choosing S, the summary statistics, and a bit the distance, but not so much the threshold epsilon. And what we can say at first is that there seems to be essentially two main types of approaches. A first category of procedure which put mainly the effort on S, on choosing the summary. And then for D, they use a standard norm, like the Euclidean norm. And the advantage of doing this is that when you summarize your observation, you reduce the variance of the distances. But if the choice of S is more or less arbitrary, you may also lose information on your observation. So it's in general, it's a difficult, it's an important and difficult problem to find the good summary statistic. But in recent years, some years ago, Fernet and Prangle proposed a nice solution to that they call semi-automatic ABC, where the idea is to add a preliminary regression step, and actually I will explain that a little bit more later. What I can say now about this method is that the only problem is that it requires the dimension d of Y to be quite small or not too big. And in particular, it cannot handle the cases where Y would be an IID sample of many vectors, even if those vectors are small in dimension. And typically also it's not so tractable when you want to handle a large time series. But it's okay for when you have one observation, one vector of observation, and when D, the dimension is not too big. No. Sorry. It's not very responsive. Yeah, okay, I don't know, sometimes it's not working. Sorry, so the second category of methods I wanted to mention is usually called data discrepancy-based procedures. And here it's almost the reverse as before. The effort is put on the distance d in order that so that you don't need to worry about S. And so the idea is to replace the distance between Y and Zm by a distance between samples, considering them as empirical distributions. So instead of vector, you assume that your Z or your Y is actually an histogram, so a sum of Dirac functions. And then because you change the way you see your observations, you need to also to change the metric, the way you compare them. And so you need a D, which is a metric between the empirical distributions now. And so this idea has been used by various people in various works, which mainly differ by the way they handle their definition of the distance. So for instance, Burton and al. In 2019, they used the Wasserstein distance to compare the samples. You can use the Kullback-Leibler distance, the MMD, and so on. So the nice thing about those methods is that they do not require a summary statistic because they compare directly the data as a sample, as a histograms. But then to be meaningful, to be efficient, they need that the sample is large enough and that your observations are ID, which means that all the dimensions should be IID and you need a lot of them so that your histogram is actually making sense. And so the problem with that is that in practice, in the type of problem we were interested at first, like inverse problems, you don't always have the possibility to repeat for the same theta value. Sometimes you have just one observation. It's not possible to have an IID sample of observations for the same theta value. So that's typically what's happened in inverse problems. So our contribution that I will present now is one good point of it is that it can be applied in both cases. So both when you have a single observation, a single vector of observation, or if you have an IID sample. But first, I want to come back to this semi-automatic ABC method by Fernand and Prangle because it's related to what we've done. So the idea in this technique is that it's based on the observation that if you want to target, if you want to design an ABC scheme that is targeting the posterior mean, then they observe that the best thing you can do about the summary statistic, S, is to set it to the posterior mean. So S of Z should be the expectation of theta given Z. So when you say that, it's a bit stupid because this quantity is exactly the one you want to estimate, so you don't know it at first. So the idea were to use a preliminary linear regression step before the ABC scheme to learn an approximation of this quantity as a function of Z. And to learn it from a data set, a set of couples of theta value and observation values, which are coming from the two joint distribution. And then to use this learn function to produce the summary statistics. So it means that if you change Z into Y, then you get you have a mapping that gives you directly S of Y. So since this time, there have been a number of works, similar works using more or less the same idea. In the first type of work, the idea is simply to replace the linear regression step by some fancier regression methods like neural networks or something more flexible than linear regression, but more or less still using the idea of using the expectation as a summary statistic. Then a second natural thing that you can think about is not to restrict to the first order moments, the expectation, but to add higher order moments, like for instance, the posterior variances. And this is actually a very natural idea, which is already mentioned in some of the previous work, but it has not been implemented yet. And I suspect that this is because it's in practice, it's not so easy to design a method which is able to provide posterior moments, higher order moments. Like, for instance, regression is giving you straightforwardly the expectation, but if you need a variance or some higher order moments, it's not that standard. And you need a method that gives you that at low cost. You don't want to spend too much time doing this. So our first contribution was to do this, to add the higher order moment in this semi-automatic ABC ID. And then a second contribution is not to restrict to moments, but why not using for the summary statistic, not just the approximation of the moments, but the full approximation of the posterior. So we use as summary statistic an approximation of the true posterior, and that's what we call the surrogate posterior. So of course, this requires two things. First, as I said before, you need a learning procedure which is able to provide in a tractable manner those surrogates. And for that, we use a method called Gaussian locally linear mapping, and I will explain next. And then, because your statistics now are not standard quantities, but are distributions, you need a proper metric to compare them, to compare distributions. So again, we'll see what we have been using. So how do we compute then those posterior surrogates? So we had surrogate posteriors. So in our case, we look for approximation of the two posteriors as mixtures of Gaussians. And we use this so-called Gleam model, and Gleam stands for Gaussian locally linear mapping. You can see the method as an inverse regression approach, which actually contains a more famous model, which is called the mixture of experts. Mixture of experts, it's a sort of one-layer neural network. So the goal of this technique is to capture the link between y and theta, the parameter, as a mixture of k affine components. And so here on the plot, you can see the idea. You want to find a mapping from the theta space to the observation space. And the assumption is that you can divide your space into regions. And on each region, the transformation is assumed to be affine. But these affine transformations are different from one region to another. So in the end, you may have something quite nonlinear. And the algorithm is finding both the exact nature of the affine transformation and the region on which they are true. So in the end, what we get, I won't get too much into details here, but what we get is for each observed y, we have a distribution which is within the family of Gaussian mixture. So it's called here PG for Gleam, of theta given y and some parameter phi. And the shape of this PG is like this. It's a mixture of Gaussian where the weights, the eta k, depend on y, like this. And also the mean of the Gaussian component, so n here is the Gaussian distribution. The mean also depends on y, and in an affine way for composite k, there is some ak bk affine transformation of y. So in the end, we have a set of parameters here. And because it's a Gaussian mixture, it's easy to learn those parameters, assuming that you have a data set, couples of thetas and y's. You can easily learn with the EM algorithm the parameters that will give you this phi, and in the end, a whole family of Gaussian mixtures. And each of these Gaussian mixtures will depend on the y that you want to inverse. So the idea is to put all the effort here in learning this general mapping between theta, the theta space and the observation space. And then when you have a new observation coming, y or z, you have a straightforward formula, a closed form formula that gives you an approximation of the posterior. And these PG are the surrogate posterior that we are going to use in our ABC scheme. So in the end, we have something which looks like an extension of semi-automatic ABC, because we replace the summary statistic by the surrogate posterior PG. So for each y, we have a PG of theta given y, which is the new S of y. And so we get something similar as the variant one that I mentioned earlier, but because we can straightforwardly replace the estimation of the expectation by the expectation of this quantity, which has a formula here. And also we can add higher order moments, like typically the variance of this PG is also available as with a formula, a bit more complex, but still quite easy to compute. And so when you change y, you change the summary statistics. It's quite straightforward. And in variant 3, we use directly the full distribution PG as a summary statistic. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we need now to compare those distribution between, we need to compare, for instance, PG theta given Y and PG theta given Z. Because those are Gaussian mixtures, we need a distance between Gaussian mixtures. And there we were lucky because there were some recent work where they have been designed what they call a mixture Wasserstein distance, which is especially made for to compare Gaussian mixtures based on some optimal transport technique. And then in this work, we also used the L2 distance because it was easy to compute between mixtures, between Gaussian mixtures. So to summarize, the Gleam ABC procedure that we get are the following. So the first step is to learn what I call this inverse operator, which is basically learning the surrogates. So you need a data set n of couples of theta and y values. From there, you find a function of z, which is a mixture distribution. And that actually gives you a first approximation of your posterior. But as we will see in the illustrations later, this approximation doesn't have to be very accurate or very good. Otherwise, I would stop at step 1 and I'll be, okay, I have my approximation. I just stop there. But you see that it's actually, there is a gain in complementing this, first approximation with an ABC scheme. So that's what we do then. In step 2, we compute distances. So you can use for that either another set or the same set that you use for learning Gleam. Then there are 3 options. The first one is you use a summary statistic, which is the expectation. So you just compute the expectation of the Gleam mixture as I showed earlier. You can use also higher order moment, like it's in the method we call EV for expectation and variance. And then if you use the full distribution, you need this new metric, so the Wasserstein metric of the L2 distance. So we call those variants NW2 ABC and L2 ABC. So that's the way you compute distances. And then you can use your favorite ABC scheme, like either rejection ABC, or in the work we also try SMC ABC, to select the theta m that have the best, the smallest distances. So usually we take a threshold epsilon, which is a quantile of the distances, to select a fixed number of theta values. And then we check that it gives theta values that are closer approximation to the true posterior compared to the one we had in the first step. So before showing some illustrations, I want to mention some properties of this procedure. So the first natural question to ask is about the behavior of what is called usually the quasi-posterior, which is this quantity here, which is the posterior that the ABC scheme is actually computing. So we have a first result where we check that when epsilon tends to 0, it means that the distance here is 10 to 0, and so because it's a proper distance, it means that the posterior here agrees. So we check that when epsilon tends to 0, the Q epsilon, the quasi-posterior, was also tending to the true posterior in total variation. So this is somehow a first thing to check, but in practice it's not very useful because if you look carefully, the pi which are inside the distance here are the true posterior, so it's not usable because we don't know these quantities. So the next result is to show that if you replace pi here by an approximation, can you also show that if your approximation becomes good enough, you also tends to the true posterior? So that's the second result. So we assume that we were approximating pi given y by a mixture of distributions that depends on k, the number of components in the mixture, and on n, n is the size of the learning set. So that now the quasi-posterior becomes this quantity. And so we show that when epsilon tends to 0, as before, but now when k, the number of components in the mixture, tends to infinity, and when the learning set also tends to infinity, then you can show that the Ellinger distance between this quasi-posterior and the true posterior will converge to 0. So this is a nice result, but I have to mention that, as usual for Gaussian mixture, we need, for mixture, sorry, we needed to assume some conditions. And those conditions are a bit restrictive in the sense that they don't contain Gaussians. It's a bit annoying because in practice, we cannot apply our result for the Gleam approximations. But it's not that bad in the sense that the conditions are satisfied when you consider truncated Gaussian distributions or mixture of those. And so in practice, it's not that bad because the parameters are always within some range. But yeah, I needed to mention that. It's, but we were not aware that we are not aware of a more general result on Gaussian mixture that will not assume compactness of the theta space or the other spaces. So now in time it's okay, but I have some illustrations. So I actually have two types of illustration. The first ones are about IID, the cases where I have IID observations. So many repeated observations from the same parameter value. I have two examples. One which is a bivariate beta model where I have 100 realizations for the same theta value. And then another one which is not really IID cases, but it's a time series, moving average of order 2. We'll see why it's in this class of examples. And then I have more standard example where I have only a single observation, a single vector of observation, but where the posterior are multimodal, because we saw that we believe that our method is more interesting in this case because in the unimodal cases, more or less all ABC schemes perform the same. And so for all this example, we compare different methods using rejection or SMC ABC. So we compare our Gleam techniques with semi-automatic ABC and also sometimes with Wasserstein ABC using different R packages. For Gleam, we use a package called XLeam, and to decide on the number of components, we use a BIC, Bayesian information criteria, to select the K. In all these cases, I'm going to show the number of points in the data in the learning set was 100,000, and for ABC, it varies between 100,000 and 1 million simulations. And usually for epsilon, we took a quantile of the distances. So let's see now. So the first example is this bivariate beta model, which is quite standard in ABC paper. It's a model with 5 parameters, and the observation is in dimension 2. But then you can have as many observations as you want for the same parameter values. So here we took 100 of them. Here we didn't set K automatically using BIC, but we set it to 100. And actually, the value of K is not that critical for the model, in the sense that if you take K too large, it doesn't matter. You should not take it too small, but the exact value is not that important. So here my observations are in dimension 2, d equal 2. There are 5 parameters. And we took a small quantile here in order to select at the end 50 points in the sample. And then we computed, so we repeated this experiment 10 times with the same true value of theta, which were all set, where all the theta values were set to 1. And we computed some averages, empirical parameter means, and some average RMSE. And these are the results. So Gleam with the Wasserstein distance is doing well. We compare with some other data discrepancy based method not exactly on the same data set though, so it's not completely comparable. But one thing I have to mention here is that unfortunately for this, so this is a typical ABC example because we don't know the posterior, the likelihood is not available. But that also means that to evaluate the methods, we don't know exactly. So here we computed the average mean and the RMSE, but there is no guarantee that this is the thing to do. So it's still a bit an open question. How do you evaluate these cases where you don't know at all the posterior? So there are a number of more computationally intensive techniques to try to assess the quality of what you do, but we haven't done that yet here. But still, this example is just there to show that it's doable. You can apply the method when there is 100 of observation. It's mainly for that we kept this example. So in the next example, it's also a standard one in ABC works. It's the moving average of order 2 example. This produces this time series. Here we took a time series of length 150. There are two parameters, θ1 and θ2. And so the dimension is 150. Yeah, I forgot to say that, so for rejection ABC, we use a quantile, but for SMC ABC, we use the implementation that is used by Pierre Jacob and Al in the Wien-Ferenc package. And it started from 2048 particles. And then at the end, we select the best 100 distances to compare with what we do for rejection ABC. So here K was selected using BIC, and we found 20. And then there is another trick here, which make it like IID cases. When learning Gleam, we use a specific structure for the covariance matrices, which amounts to say that we cut the time series into smaller time series. Here we cut it into 5 sub time series of length 30. And it's like if we had 5 repetition of a moving average with size 30. And then we did that 100 times with the same parameter value. And here we know the true posterior, so it's more assessing the methods, comparing them is easier. So here you get the true values that were computed numerically. Here you have the MSE for the techniques that are not using Gleam, and you see that here the best one is the one that uses the first and second order, the first 2, autocovariants, which are known to be good statistics for this model. Actually, we recovered the fact that it's good, except for the estimating the correlation between θ1 and θ2. It's less good for this quantity. Here we try all the Gleam techniques, including rejection ABC and SMC. And in this case, SMC is usually doing the best, but very close to rejection ABC. We didn't notice a very large improvement. What we noticed, though, is that the Gleam mixture itself, if you look at the numbers, it's for θ1 especially, it's not very good at the start. But using adding an ABC scheme with Gleam, you can reduce quite a lot the error. So that means that you don't need the Gleam mixture at start may not be a good approximation, but you can refine it quite well with adding ABC after it. We compare with some other techniques. ABC DNN is using a neural network. So again, it's not exactly the same simulations that they use, so it's comparable, but it gives us a sort of idea. So then we consider more standard example, more standard in the sense that we have a single observation Y. Oh, I see. Maybe there is. I forgot to check the chat. Shall I check the chat for? Sure. Okay, so that's maybe for later. Yeah, I forgot to say, if you don't hesitate to stop me or scream if you see, because we are not expert in ABC procedure actually, so don't hesitate to scream or tell us if there is an important reference missing, and I can always pretend that it's because of jet lag. No problem. If I say something wrong, scream. So the next example is also a sort of toy example, but it's been designed to have multiple modes. And actually a very weird example. It's the likelihood is completely tractable, but it's just for fun, let's say. It's a mixture of student distribution where the mean is a bit weird, and it's this quantity here, and it's designed so that the posterior distribution will concentrate around 4 hyperbolas, like you see here, and the theta parameter is a bivariate parameter, which is a point in the 2D space. So here is this point here, and what this model is saying is that all the points which are on the same hyperbola as the theta, the true theta, basically they give the same observation. So that's why we have the posterior is such a weird shape. Then for fun, we run a simple metropolis hasting on this example, and here we use a setting which allows the sampler to move quite far away, and so you see it's quite a big mess. It doesn't recover at all the shapes of the posterior, which is not very surprising. It was just to check that it was not a too easy case. So then we compare the other methods, basically the Gleam method we propose for this example. So here BIC select 38. And yeah, I forgot to say that this example was also constructed in order that the posterior expectation is always 0 by symmetry. Whatever the observation y and the theta, the true theta, the posterior of theta given y is always 0 because it's fully symmetric. And so we did that to fail, so that the procedure that used the expectation as a summary statistic would fail. And that's what we observe. It's not surprising. The semi-automatic ABC is completely off. And also Gleam ABC, which is using the expectation also as a summary statistic, is not good. But what is surprising here, and I still don't know what happened here, is that it's not good, but it's still a bit more structured than semi-automatic ABC, although they are supposed to estimate the same quantity, which is the posterior mean. Then another thing I want to say here is that so this is the Gleam mixture approximation, the step 1, and what you can see here is that it's not too bad. It's already quite good. And also remember that we started with 38 components, so 38 Gaussian to capture the whole mapping between the theta space and y. But for a given specific y, there are only 8 of them that are actually activated. That's what it means. Here you can see more or less there are 8 Gaussians to describe this shape. So that means that the 38 components are useful, but for a given y, they are not all expressed. Then for the Gleam, then first when you add the posterior variances, you improve a lot the sample. So that means that the posterior variances, they are informative about the parameters, in contrast to the expectation, which is always 0, and then it doesn't contain any information on theta. And then we can even refine a little bit. I don't know if it's so visible on the plots, but using the full posterior as statistics, you can refine the sample. And so then it's not so clear, it's not so visible what is the best method here, because either using the Wasserstein distance of the L2 or even the SMC instead of rejection ABC. Maybe SMC is a bit better here in the center. There are more points, but it's not so. They all perform more or less the same, I would say. Then I will finish with a real data example, which is coming from planetary science, where the goal is to solve an inverse problem. So the goal is actually to estimate parameters that characterize the surface of a planet. Here it's Mars, actually. And you want to estimate those parameters from some observation Y. And more specifically, here we have 4 parameters, omega, theta bar, B, and C. And we want to estimate them from a Y which is of dimension 10. And each dimension represents a geometry at which the satellite here is looking at the surface. And here at the bottom, you have an example of the signals we have to inverse. So they are in dimension 10. But for each point at the surface, we only have one observation, such a signal. So 10 values. So we applied our techniques to this case. So we inverted a vector Y which corresponds to a material which is called a non-tronite, which is typically found on meteorites or something like that. And so we use a Gleam mixture with 40 components because that's coming from a previous work where 40 was said to be good. And we checked actually BIC, and with BIC we found 39. So we didn't recompute everything with 39 because the exact value of K is not that important. And that's what we got. So we tried the different Gleam and also semi-automatic ABC. And what you can see is that for 3 of the parameters, omega, B, and C, the methods, they're all more or less agreed that the posterior is unimodal and at the same mode, more or less, which are those values in black here. And for the last parameter, theta bar, they more or less also all agree that here it's probably bimodal. And that means that for theta bar, there are possibly 2 values that would correspond to the observed Y. And so those values are here in red. And so again, we don't have ground truth information for this example. So the only thing we can do is to reconstruct the signals that would correspond to these parameter values and compare it with the signal that we inverse. So in red here, you have the Y that we inverse. And in the 2 black curves correspond to the signal which is reconstructed using this parameter value. And I forgot to say on the previous slide that in this type of problems, inverse problem, we have the direct model. We know this F here, which allows us to simulate some Y from some theta value. So that's the direct model. And so that means that if you have a theta value, you can reconstruct what would be the observed Y. So that's what we do here, and we observe that, well, it's not too bad in the sense that the 2 solutions, they are indeed close to each other and close to the Y which has been observed. And so that suggests that probably here there are actually 2 solutions for this case. So now to conclude, I just want to summarize what we've done. So it's a sort of extension of semi-automatic ABC, where instead of using summary statistics, we use a surrogate posterior as a summary statistic. So it's a sort of functional summary statistic. And one nice thing is that it can be used both in the case of a single observation and in the case of IID observation, and then it can be used as an alternative also to discrepancy-based techniques. But of course, to do that, you need 2 things. You need a tractable model to learn the surrogates, and scalable also if you want to deal with high-dimensional D. So for Gleam, typically, I would say we can go easily up to 100 dimension, and maybe more if you use the Gleam IID implementation. So you can go for IRD. Then, because Gleam is based on an EM algorithm, it's really easy to handle missing data and also potential other latent variables. And then the second thing you need is a metric, because now your summary statistics are distribution. You need a proper metric between distribution to compare them. So a distance, really, you need. So we have investigated 2 of them, but there may exist other ones. But it's not so straightforward, because if your surrogates are a mixture of some weird densities, they may not exist like something like a Wasserstein distance that is tractable. In terms of first result and conclusion, we observe that using this technique, we don't need to choose a summary statistic. We have a convergence result, although with some restriction, but it's still satisfying. We observed that the method was behaving well, especially when the posterior was multimodal. Also that the quality of the surrogate was not critical. You can start with a not so good approximation of your posterior, but what's important is that it's this approximation be discriminative, be informative about the parameter. And also for now, but it has to be confirmed, I had the impression that the Wasserstein base distance was a bit more robust than L2, for instance. And in terms of future work, well, there are a number of things it's still ongoing work. We can try other ABC schemes than rejection and SMC. Of course, the main thing about Gleam is the cost. It's most of the time it's more costly than other methods, like typically semi-automatic ABC. It's super fast, and especially if you want to select K in a data-driven way, if like running BIC for a number of value of K and then discarding all of them except the one you select is quite a waste of time and data. So we are currently investigating what's called a Bayesian non-parametric way to select K. Of course, there may be other metrics to compare the distributions to be investigated. So all this has been done in an ABC context, but I believe it's also you can transfer this idea in a Bayesian synthetic likelihood context. Also, another thing which is easy to do with Gleam is what's called sequential learning. You could, instead of learning the mapping between theta and y without knowing where is your theta value, you could use some prior or use some more clever way. And then also you could replace Gleam by some other techniques to estimate the surrogate. So there are something called mixture density network with, like Gleam are producing Gaussian mixture. So this technique would be used straightforwardly in what we have done. But you can also investigate fancier neural network like invertible neural network or normalizing flows. Although in these cases, I'm not sure if it's easy to find a distance to compare those. And that's it. I'd like to thank these people who were at the start of this project somehow, and also Benoit and Sylvain who helped with the remote sensing application. And yes, thanks for your attention. The paper is actually available on this site, but we are at the moment revising it, so in some weeks you may get a better version. And these are the references. So thanks for your attention.
Thanks very much, Florence. That was a really great talk. So do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, there was a question. Oh, it's for you. So the question is, oh, you see it. Maybe I should read it. I don't know. Can the ID be extended to transfer learning? Chris can elaborate. So it's a question for you.
Apparently I can elaborate. I'm not sure if that's really true. So I can tell you about the transfer learning problem. It's when you have a source data set and you fit some kind of model to that data, but then you have a target region for which you only have sparse data, and the model may not be the same as the original source. So the question is, like, can you use the source model to make predictions at the target? So that's sort of the transfer learning sort of problem.
Something we can do easily with Gleam is when the noise is different, you can, because the idea is not to recompute, to relearn the whole model when you change something.
Mm-hmm.
And this is possible to a certain extent with Gleam, but probably not in a very general case.
Okay.
But for instance, in the remote sensing application, we were provided with the direct model plus a noise, some sigma, let's say. And then when you apply it on real data, they give you another sigma. Because the observation, they come with the y vector, but also some uncertainty values. And the model we have learned, it's with a sigma which we fixed before knowing what they would give us. And then you don't have to relearn everything. You can adapt so that's the property of the Gaussian distributions.
Mm-hmm.
But for something more complex than that, I'm not sure.
Any questions here?
Thanks a lot. That was a really nice talk. I was wondering about you mentioned at the end the computational nature of that first estimating your surrogate. Because I'm quite interested in cases where your forward simulation problem is also quite expensive. So that could be like a 20-minute, PDE solve or something like that. So you'll have quite sparse data points for that surrogate. Will that affect things? Like, will you still be able to fit one of these surrogates and still, I guess, learn enough to be able to push the posterior in the right direction?
Yeah,
well, so I guess like how much training data do you need for the surrogate?
Yeah, well, at first we were interested in a model that are called amortized, which means that we were interested in a situation where you don't have to inverse only one y, but a million of them. So then we want the model to be usable, whatever the observation value. And in that case, you better estimate your Gleam model in a larger space as possible. But if you know that your parameter is in this part of the space, you can concentrate your learning on this space. And that's also something you can do with sequential learning. At first, you don't know where the things are, so you put the points sparsely in the space. You estimate the first Gleam model, and it gives you weights. It's a sort of important sampling, and then you can refine the region where you are going to put your simulations and sort of sequentially improve the Gleam learning. But then it's not amortized. You have to redo that. Each time you change your y, you have to redo the sequential. So it's a compromise. It depends on what kind of problem you have to solve. And but one thing I could say about the fact that the forward model may be costly. One thing we notice with Gleam or with mixture models actually is that it's much more compared to neural networks. The one we try was some standard CNN. It seems to extrapolate better. So that means that it may depend on the model we are actually inversing. So, but it means that with even if with this kind of Gleam model, even if you simulate only in one part of the space, it's able to extrapolate outside. And neural networks, they are less good at that, apparently.
So I wonder if even with all of that, the number of simulated data points is still fairly constrained because of the computation time. Could you consider looking at like a two-stage surrogate where you might have an approximate model as well that you can sample a lot of to get an initial surrogate and then scaffold off that to something where you're using a more expensive model?
What's called a surrogate in data simulation, the surrogate of the forward model then?
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? So maybe I have a really simple question. So what's the L2 distance between distributions?
It's actually I have it somewhere. It's the I think I have it in some another slide. Show you. Oh, no. I had it. Oh, sorry. Yes, here it is. So it's this. It's you can show that the L2 distance between two Gaussian distribution is actually this quantity here.
Mm-hmm.
It's the PDF at mu1 for PDF of mu2 given. So this is quite straightforward.
Okay.
And then for the L2 between two mixture, it's like a. So you can see that as a scalar product, and then you have a sort of quadratic form.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, because you can also can you compute the Kullback-Leibler divergence between two mixtures, two Gaussian mixtures?
I think so. Yeah, but it's it's numerical. No, it's like we don't have a formula. No?
I think there's a closed form. Yeah.
I don't remember. Yeah, I don't remember. But,
Yeah, so the trick here is that there's a simplification due to the mixture construction, the finite mixture construction that allows you to decompose any particular distances between the two mixture models into weighted distances between their mixture components. So in respect to that, you can kind of use that construction and then substitute in whatever distance between Gaussian distributions that you like, and
right.
most well-known distances have closed form solutions for distance between Gaussian distributions. So in that respect, you can definitely do KLs.
Yeah,
but you'd want to do the symmetrized KL, because I think that there's something in our work that depends on the distance property and not just the.
Yeah, the KL it won't be a proper distance, but you can use a symmetric
and
one.
not just the Bregman property. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, I don't know what would be the best distance in this case.
Yeah, it seemed like the Wasserstein one really outperformed that L2 though.
Yeah,
in your examples.
L2 it's too. I guess it's a bit too sensitive in a way. I have an example where you can see that. Maybe it's before. Sorry. For the hyperbola example, for instance. Yeah. So here is it's a sort of hyperbola example. Here we have only two hyperbolas, and those are representing the value of the distances for every point in the. So in blue you can see the lower distances.
Yeah, it's a lot.
And so
noisy.
the L2 is a bit too.
It's more noisy, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, but also it's not as permissive in a way.
Yeah.
Maybe it's too strict.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's an explanation, but it's a bit too sharp in a way. Not robust, I would say.
Yeah.
But for this example, I'm not sure it's the same for all examples. Someone is saying that they are probably not a closed form for KL because the mixture doesn't interact nicely with the load. Yeah, actually, I don't remember.
Maybe it's something we have to investigate. Yeah.
Yeah, using the trick we use in the mixture Wasserstein. Yeah, sorry, I forgot to say this distance that we call mixture Wasserstein distance. It's a specific distance. It's not the Wasserstein between two Gaussian mixtures.
Right. Okay.
Because this one is not tractable.
Okay.
Yeah, I forgot to say it's a bit misleading. The mixture Wasserstein distance is not the Wasserstein distance between two mixtures.
Yeah. Okay.
It's something else, but it's captured some distance.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so for the KL, it's the same. The KL between two mixtures may not be available, but this trick of computing the KL between the components and then weighting them according to the weights of the mixtures, something like that.
Yeah. Awesome. Any final questions? So if there's no more questions, let's thank Florence again for a really great talk. And I guess that brings us to the end for today. So thanks very much, everyone, for coming along. So both the people who've come onto campus and also the people on Zoom, thanks for joining in. And I guess it's bye for now.